Hey, so we're going for video streaming.
Yeah.
So I'll say.
No.
Hi, Randall. Is it no? Okay. Well, let's make a start. We're only an even smaller group than normal. Or you're just going to?
I'm just gonna.
But yeah, it always feels it you never know. And it's interesting. I in the last week or so, obviously we had the book launch, and I was at a prayer and fasting conference yesterday. And I mentioned in that context that we're doing this sort of work through the Sermon on the Mount and just giving some kind of space to kind of where modern psychology's got to. And it was interesting how much interest it stirred up. So it's just one of those things that I'm sure is going to be worth doing again at some point. And so this, in one sense, helps to kind of hone the thing and get things in order. So let's pray, and then you never know, somebody else might turn up. So otherwise, I'll look at yeah. So Father, we just thank you for the opportunity, for the space. And Father, I just keep going back to that verse because it's, as I say, it kind of feels like the verse that keeps on giving in Romans 8 about the way the Spirit intervenes because we don't always know how to, and that's actually part of the change of who we are psychologically, is because there's a lot in the psychology that is beyond our understanding or beyond our knowledge, but you get down there and you know what's needed, and it says, and He knows the inclinations of the mind, of the spirit, the heart, the spirit, and you know our inside. You know the way we're put together, and so you intervene effectively. You intercede on our behalf, and so Jesus, just make that a part of the whole context of what we're looking at. That even when we kind of see things and think, I don't know if I can quite get my head around that. Do I want to understand that? Father, we know with confidence that your Spirit is working on those things in us anyway. In Jesus' name. Amen. 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 So I noticed when I was putting this together, of course, we're doing week 5, which is not actually Beatitude number 5, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, because of course we, as we pointed out, the way the Sermon on the Mount kind of exposits each of the Beatitudes, it does so in reverse order. So we're on week 5. We're actually getting up near the top of the beginning run of Beatitudes. So we're on. Does that make it 3 or 4? So I just think, with having left my Bible behind and now having to work off the text here. So is it 3rd or 4th? 3. Yeah, it is 3. That's right. I thought.
Actually, no, I think it's 4th.
Okay. All right. Well, I was wrong. I have to work out. We've still got blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who mourn. So yeah. So it's the 4th. It's the 4th one. But in this one, it's actually this. If we're in the reason I mention that now is because in the kind of exposition order, this is the second time we're going to have looked at hungering, at righteousness. If you remember, at the end of the run of Beatitudes, the last one is blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. So in terms of the exposition that Jesus does, that's the first one he does. Blessed are you, therefore, when people persecute you, and he turns it around and so on. So now we're back to righteousness, but this time the context is hungering and thirsting. And so it's important, it struck me as I was just thinking about it, as we were putting these together, that we're looking at righteousness twice, and there must be aspects in the words that Jesus uses, and we thought about that what... We'll probably touch a little bit tonight again, only just touching on it as to why righteousness does draw persecution. But tonight we'll think about hungering and thirsting. It's that place of really desiring righteousness. It's not necessarily succeeding in this context. It's actually the desire for it, that you want to go for it, that there's something in you. And what's really interesting as you kind of draw through is it makes a lot of sense in the context of a modern approach to moral behaviour, which you're going to see is that, we put one up a couple of weeks ago, that a huge amount of moral behaviour is actually driven by immoral motives, if I can put it that way. And so actually what Jesus is doing by focusing on the hunger and thirst is actually paring back the desire to do the right thing to really being the desire to do the right thing. Not the desire to do the right thing because then I got something that I benefit from and it's a little bit mixed up. But right at the kind of core heart issue, and in the context of that. Why? This way. Why is this not now? See if this will go. What's happening with my slides? There we go. Finally, it's moving. Let's see if this now. Nope, this is. Oh, I bet this is not working because. Sorry, this will look great on the streaming. Yeah, I haven't got a battery in there, so that's why that's not working. So I'll just. I've got into the habit of taking the battery out because it lasts longer. It doesn't get accidentally. Okay, so now I'll just have to do it with my finger. So old school. So when it comes to kind of righteousness, Jesus takes a kind of classic trio from the Jewish point of view, which is prayer, fasting, and giving. And as I say, the context and the way he unpacks them is he gets right the way back to the kind of the core motive for why we even want to do it. So it's the motive of those who do the right thing, and it's very, very kind of clear. So it all starts with beware of performing your charity or your good deeds. Beware of performing your charity in front of people, or else you have no reward from the Father who is in heaven. And it is a fascinating thing that in the modern world, charity is big business, and people benefit hugely, and it's all understood and talked about by PR gurus, psychologists, and everybody. Which is, of course, it's very important to be seen to be associated with the right good deeds, if I can put it that way. It's a totally modern current phenomena. And it was also true in Jesus' day, and actually part of the reason you can actually get a feel from as you kind of dig down into the kind of the deeper layers of human psychology as to why it is that we want to be seen as moral, if I can put it that way. So a couple of weeks ago we put this slide up, I think it was last time, wasn't it? Which was this wonderful little quote I found in a scientific paper. It's actually a review paper, so it's looking at various other surveys and doing a kind of meta-narrative across them. And it refers to moral hypocrisy. It gives it the title, The Construct with 1,000 Faces. And you got this quote, it says, the entire field of social psychology could be called the science of moral hypocrisy, because there are so many things that as social psychology has looked at it, we discover that actually the desire to appear something, and in particular things that have a moral dimension to them, is so strong that a huge chunk of human behaviour and social behaviour and the things that define behaviour are actually about projecting a moral image where there is very little, if you like, underneath. And so you have whole situations which you have to be careful because we're streaming, so we don't mention which ones they are, but occasionally they come up in the newspapers with quite large, well-known UK charities that are challenged by the Charity Commission because they're not actually doing very much. And their argument back is, well, if we spend £1 million and we then raise 1.2 million and we give 0.2 million to the charity, that's better than if we didn't do it. But actually, if you like, 80% of the work is really just about profiting those who work with them. People feel good in terms of employment because they don't want to work for a petrochemical company because they're very environmentally aware, but they don't mind working for Greenpeace because actually being able to employ people in those things kind of becomes part of the logic of why this is a good moral charity. And so it is a kind of a current thing. It hits politics. And I don't want to kind of throw mud unfairly at any one particular organisation because to do so would be to miss what Jesus is driving at in many ways, which is that it's a very human instinct to want to desire to be part of something that's good, to appear righteous. It's actually much harder to be righteous, and because of those two things, there is often a gap that appears. Which is why I think it's so important that within the flow of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives special attention to asking us the question to think of what is it I really desire? What is it I would do if nobody knew? It's that kind of simple question, which of course in public we all answer, oh, of course I know. But I used to, when I was, well, not used to, probably still do, I just haven't asked it for a few years now, but I used to use it quite regularly. When you meet someone who's looking for guidance and a sense of calling and they want to talk about those things, and I would actually ask them to think about life seriously in a year's time, and of course it would be quite a miracle because they would all claim not to play the lottery, but if they played the lottery and they won the lottery, what would you really be doing? What would your life genuinely look like next year if you won the lottery? And I would kind of challenge them to try and think about the things that actually they're a bit embarrassed about. That if they because in absolute seriousness, I think I actually kind of someone who kind of understood it to a degree. There was even in people who go to church, so even in people, maybe we shouldn't be surprised by this at all. Sometimes you get answers back where people say, I actually have to think, would I stay with my family? Would I stay with my wife or my husband? And that's an honest moment. That's not something to go and broadcast and say they're about to, but actually the challenge of if money wasn't any object, actually part of the reason we're sticking together is because it'd just be too darn difficult at the moment. Now, and it's a fascinating kind of question, if I can put it that way. That what is it that makes us behave morally? Because there are all sorts of benefits from moral behaviour, and so that's why I don't want to overly rubbish it. In other words, even if that is the state that someone's relationship is in, it is better that we're working through it in a place where we are together, and we may only be doing that because we can't afford to separate, but actually that's not a bad pressure from the outside. It at least helps us do the right thing, even if it's for the wrong motives. So we don't want to kind of totally write off the fact that we do, but Jesus tries to draw our attention. So the entire field of social psychology can be called the science of moral hypocrisy. It is widespread, it is common, and Jesus therefore addresses it, and it's kind of quite encouraging. I put this little, why do people like to follow moral rules rather than just logical rules? Now that may not sound sensible to you, but I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. We like people who follow moral rules, not just logical rules. Sorry, that's the way I put it there. So you'll have come across, it's more of a moral philosophy question than a psychology question, but what's called the trolley dilemma, which you can spell out in multiple ways, where you have a runaway tram, and you're the person standing at the switching line, and you have to make a choice. If you do nothing, it's going to kill 5 people, or you have to actively choose, and you could change the course, and it will kill somebody else. And from a moral philosophy point of view, they play it out in multiple different ways. Sometimes it's just pushing a lever. Sometimes you ask it in terms of if you had to push somebody in front of the trolley to actually, because by falling in front of it, they would stop it before it killed the others. And there's all these different ways that it gets played out. So what was actually done is then social psychology started to look at the impact of people's decision making in the process on groups. And so they started to kind of run through these trolley experiments. And of course, the people taking part in them didn't think that they were taking part in a social or psychological survey. They thought they were playing a moral game because everybody's heard about the thing. But one of the things that came out that was kind of really interesting is okay, I didn't put a separate slide, is that actually people who are too logical, if I can put it this way, if you're too logical, we don't trust them. And I've got there, what we want internal values have got to have quality to them, not just quantity. And so as they kind of played out the scenario, what they found is if someone was seen to make the decision too quickly, kill one person because it saves 5, it's easy, simples. There's no real question. If you stop and abstract it, it's just logic. You've got an action, you actually make things, I guess it's not perfect, but it's 10 times, well, it's not 10 times, it's 5 times better than killing 5, that's easy. If that's too easy for people, the people in the group don't trust them and don't like them, so they started to kind of explore this dynamic. And as it's kind of being unfolded, it tells a really fascinating story, because it's getting to the heart of what we hear, in Paul's words when he says, the good that I would do, I don't do, and so on, which is to do with the batting backwards and forwards between different parts of the higher functioning brain. So we get to kind of play with all sorts of fancy names now. So I'm keeping this. In a healthy human, we all make a decision with a kind of a balanced play, and it is a play. Things go backwards and forwards between 2 parts of the brain which sit in the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, if you like, the most human part of the brain, and the most where we do most of our analytical thinking and things like language are, all our unique facilities we find there, is the frontal cortex, and the interface between that and the kind of area sometimes referred to as the midbrain is the prefrontal cortex, so just before you get to the frontal cortex, and in there we find a couple of key parts or key kind of sections which light up when we have to make difficult decisions. Any kind of decision that involves people and things. Basically there are two areas so that we're going to touch on tonight. So which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that is, if I think I put there the Vulcan brain, it's a Vulcan thinking. That is where you do your logical assessment, and that is where you say there's 5 people or there's 1 person, easy choice. Even if I have to push the person in front of the train to stop it, that's the right choice. That's where you would make that decision. And it kind of purely deals with things as kind of logical tokens and so on. But it doesn't do so instantly. The only people it pretty much does it instantly are psychopaths. So it's always we kind of be wary about this. That in actual fact, we are deeply distrusting of people who make their decisions too quickly, even if they come to the same conclusion. What we want to actually see in them is the struggle and the batting backwards and forwards between the other part of the prefrontal cortex, which we're going to think of tonight, which is the ventromedial. And the ventromedial prefrontal cortex basically is, although it's in the higher part of the brain, what they call the third brain, it basically is totally in sync with the. It becomes like the interface for the amygdala and the limbic system, which is where the emotional kind of centers of the brain are. And so when we have a difficult decision, and if you put it this way, is when your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex wins, you do the difficult thing, which is better for you in the long term. So in the classic kid experiment where you stick them down and there's some marshmallows on the table, and you can have one now, or if you wait till I come back, you can have 2. And which kids can hold off and which ones can't. This is a kind of a classic in one sense, which is in this occasion. And when the kid takes one now for instant reward, actually the ventromedial prefrontal cortex has won the argument, which it's weighed up the kind of immediacy of reward and the feeling that goes with it, and that has dominated the ability to logically think forwards. And so the way that the two interplay is that the analytical parts of the brain are feeding a kind of a summary to the prefrontal cortex to do the maths. But instead of just doing the maths, the prefrontal cortex is then talking to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is taking information and assigning values to things. And so it throws into the mix a much more complicated thing. And the kind of values it has is what's important to me, that actually I wouldn't cause anybody any harm. If it's important to me that I wouldn't cause anybody any harm, even though it would be better that 1 person dies than 5 people die, suddenly it's not so easy, because actually that's worth at least 3 people in my thinking. Does that, you see what I mean? And that kind of weighting is coming via this interface. And so at the hard, fast end of the day, we should all be like Spock, if you like, if you're just maximising the outcome of the situation. But we don't like it when we meet people like that, because actually we are looking to how much we can trust them. And what we notice is if they are not adequately kind of weighing and waiting, and kind of there's something going on, and somehow subconsciously we're able to read the wavering in the person. If it's too quick and instant, we actually feel that I couldn't trust them with risking myself. Supposing I was the person they had to push under the trolley. If it was too easy, if there was no question in it, if there was no time thinking, what if it was one of my children, what if it was one of my friends, something at a subconscious level means that we find them difficult to trust. Making sense? So in actual fact, we want people to be genuinely human. We recognise and honour that in the end we would think doing the right thing is, we want them to do the logical thing, if you like.
So, to interrupt, just to prove your point, you said people are not keen on Spocks.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're saying that, it really took me right back to Star Trek, because you had Doc McCoy on one side, quite emotional, what have you. You had Spock on the other side, who'd throw, you knew him, he'd throw you under the bus to save everybody else. Yeah. And then you had the poor Captain Kirk, who had to wrestle with these dilemmas. So he was more appealing than Spock, because he was human. Yeah. And so, as you said, that emotional balancing. He knows something has to happen. Spock's very clear what has to happen. Yeah. McCoy is normally attacking Spock. How can you say that sort of thing?
And so
I'm just thinking, it actually proves what you're saying. Just thinking of my response to that, or people's response to Kirk in that little... And
what they're saying is it's not in the end the final decision. It's actually in the context of seeing how quickly people get there and how the process... and in terms of what's going on in the brain, you're getting, if you like, between these two parts, which are part of the interface, if you like, between the logic centres and the emotional centres. Information is sent down to the two, and they integrate and they kind of roll with each other, and you make the decision. In psychopathy, when the person's a total psychopath, what you find is the one totally dominates. So that to some level or degree, that's sometimes comes down to being male or female, being brought up in an artistic home or a scientific home. There are all sorts of bits, but we want to see. But on the whole, we want to be able to kind of pick up from people that process is genuinely going on in their head, if you can put it that way. So what that's showing is not necessarily that they finally always choose an emotional rule, because I said moral rules, not just logical. They want their logical rules to have some level of kind of trustworthiness in it. And so in actual fact, we will, most people will struggle much more with the question of if it's somebody I know, if I actually physically have to do it, than if it's just a logical. We want to kind of see that in people. So as a result, if you like, if we say normal human behaviour is looking for virtue signalling or moral signalling, the signalling of moral thinking. So things like trustworthiness, and therefore, if we see so therefore it is a relevant question to most people that if a politician is unfaithful to his husband or wife, his or her husband or wife, then perhaps they're not going to be that trustworthy with me, because that's the assumption that is being drawn out in this kind of process that's being highlighted. And so in actual fact, one of the very key things, the very first things we're looking when we encounter someone, as it turns out, we'll have a look at in a second, one of the first things that is being judged and assessed is how, if you like, morally balanced are they? Which doesn't mean logically morally balanced, it means humanly morally balanced, if I kind of get that idea. I.e. that there's a proper toing and froing, and even if they make the hard logical decision at the end of the day, but they understand the cost of that, and somehow that's been reflected in the way they process it. So in terms of actually doing righteousness, we want to, although it's something we can't practice in one sense, but as we do, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is likely to be winning most of the time, but it needs to do so with a proper interface at that kind of emotional level, if that makes sense. And when it doesn't, it's probably what leads to why commonly we think of righteous people as becoming self-righteous, why there is a tendency for righteousness to be experienced by people as something they don't trust, and they call it self-righteousness. Which is, somehow it feels to me that it's so easy for you that you're not going through a proper human process, which is valuing the fact that I'm actually your friend. Shouldn't I count for a little bit more, seeing as I've invested into you and you've invested into me? Doesn't that count for anything? Does that make sense? And at a logical sense, it's easy to say, well, it shouldn't, because all people are equal under God and so on. But at another level, actually, we ought to reciprocate. That's part of the way we've been made too, if you see what I mean. So it's not always an easy, instant, turn-on answer. So DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, has been practicing saying that a few times. It helps us do the right thing when it's not easy, but it actually reduces values. This is the way it works. It reduces values and therefore people to numbers and statistics, and that's how it kind of gets there. And so if it does that too quickly and too easily, it is not something that people find trustworthy or they like. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex adds weights to the steps proposed effectively to it. So as a result, we are more trusting and we're more favourably disposed to those that signal their moral instincts to us. And we actually kind of go into kind of most relationships. There is something at us at a subconscious level. You can remember there's a huge amount of thinking that goes on that makes us work, which is automatic. You drive here without thinking about changing gear. You don't think how many times you did it. You don't plan it before you drive, you just do it. And huge amounts of life just work in certain ways. And one of the things that's just working is we're meeting people and we're looking for the little signals that are showing to us that someone actually processes things and thinks in ways that we see as genuinely humanly moral. rather than logically moral. I'm trying to make the distinction between the two. Because while they might come to the same conclusions, one will somehow you will know it struggles to get there because it's weighing other things. So in actual fact, it's what's commonly, again, it's one of these things that's been researched and in surveys, is people will answer much quicker that they would rather have an incompetent person in charge than one who could ignore their moral values when they need to. So we would rather have someone who's second rate, rather than the person who's a genius, but actually I just don't trust them. When it comes to it, I don't know how they would react in these sorts of ways. Which of course, yeah. And actually, yeah, so the next little bit of paper I've got up here, this one, Moral Character Predominates, this was actually the title, Moral Character Predominates in Person Perception and Evaluation. So a few years back, the logic was that the thing that people appreciate most is warmth. So politicians were learning from psychology, you need to be warm, kiss the babies, all those sorts of things. But in more recent years, the question has been noticed that actually warmth, in its rather fuzzy way, the way that people even perceive it, is very often to do with this kind of moral juggling, if you like. And so it's been looked at a little bit more deeply. And actually now the tendency, I should say, because things are never 100%, but there's a tendency towards recognising that actually the predominant thing that people notice when they're assessing new people or when they're meeting new people is their moral character. So it's 2013, this paper, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So they kind of conclude moral character is more important than warmth in perception formation and in identity construction. So when I meet Howard for the first time, the impression he leaves is more based on what I've perceived of his morals than it is whether he's friendly or warm. In fact, people who are friendly or warm but I don't feel I trust their values, I end up thinking they're fake. Because in our minds we often associate the two things. So if someone is being warm but somehow we don't feel they're being true, now we can be wrong in our reading, but what this is getting across is that actually our perception of that moral character is perhaps they conclude it is the most important factor in our impression, and when we try to build and understand someone's identity. And therefore they seem warm, but I'm not sure if I can really trust them. That's part of the identity that we're effectively creating with that individual. So as a result, of course, as it points out, there are huge social trade-offs to being seen as moral and to learning how to signal your morality. And so we get the modern phenomena, which you get on social media, where they talk about virtue signalling, which is we want to wear our badge that says the good causes that we're involved in, stick them on my guitar if I'm a guitarist. And that's a simple kind of way. We kind of post the thing when we're doing something worthwhile. We kind of drop hints at it. So virtue signalling becomes actually something that's very important for me to do if I want to build trust with somebody else. You see, it's why it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. It's helpful to let people know that I'm a good person and I think about things, even if actually what I'm doing doesn't really reflect kind of an inner desire, hunger or thirst internally. There is just, and we can, because of the way we're so good at self-deceiving ourselves, we get a good feeling from the fact that we tell people that we're giving to this charity or we're involved in that good work or whatever. That produces a good feeling, and we think that actually we feel favourably and well disposed towards that good work, when really what we're feeling favourably disposed towards is the feeling we get from the fact that actually it helps us by flagging those things. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Now I have to be very kind of careful what I say on as this is going out all over the place, but some people in this room, without mentioning who, will know that of course I used to kind of, when I was leading the church, we used to kind of write to folks to thank them for their giving, and it is absolutely fascinating, and I really don't say this with any kind of sense of judgment. It is interesting how some of the people who spoke the most about giving in the church were terrible givers. I'm saying that without mentioning any names. But you can't help noticing it when you're writing to thank people. And one of the things I actually used to kind of cynically, I used to talk with Judy, not to be horrible, but just because you have to, is actually that there was one particular person, sorry, I'm laughing now, because I do know names, I'm not going to mention them. There's one particular person that was always wanting to know, was always going on very serious about how much they give to the church and wanting to know how every penny was spent. And we always tried to be as open and transparent as possible. But when it actually came down to it, I sat down and worked out, I actually said to Judith, I reckon his kids eat more in value of biscuits every month than he actually gives through the offering, and yet he's always wanting to know exactly what's going on with it, because he wants to know his giving is being well spent. Now, I'm laughing not because I want to be unkind, because actually I like this person. I have a terrible tendency to like people with all those kinds of... No, it's not a terrible tendency. I like people's flaws. I like people with their flaws. I don't want to be too judgmental. I'm just saying the reality is that we sometimes what we're talking about is about projecting something that isn't necessarily, and there can be all sorts of deep-seated psychological reasons. There can be totally, the person could have been in a church where money was so badly mishandled, or their parents got taken by some kind of terrible prosperity gospel teacher who did whatever. All those kinds of things I know can all be part of the mix. But actually the reality is it's much easier sometimes to talk than the walk. And that is one of the things they conclude. It's a quote from Somerset Maugham. It says, "You choose your friends, but you can't. But don't be shortchanged by choosing person." Sorry, you can choose your friends, but don't be shortchanged by choosing personality over character. And that is the thing that most people bring into the equations. How we're kind of assessing it, how we're trying to judge it. So, as I said, yeah, what we were just saying, in practice, therefore, it is easier to signal virtue than to be virtuous. And actually, further, one of the conclusions of the paper I just put up was they actually touched on this, that verbalizing virtue actually has shown in two directions to be both a very effective as a self-deceptive strategy. So the situation I was just talking about, there was probably a sense in which when you talk about it an awful lot, you con yourself of the fact that you don't really do it because you're talking about it so much, if I can put it that way. It's somehow in you, you know that it's important, therefore if it's important to you...
Protest too much.
Yes, I know, that's right, it comes to the lady that protests too much, doesn't it? But actually there is a thing where a part of that talking up what we do is actually, it seems, part of, which has been measured, as I said, is actually sometimes part of a self-deception strategy, and at the same time, so it actually kind of suppresses the feelings people have of moral dissonance, because there's something in the subconscious part of the brain that feels that you've talked about it so much, it must be important there, therefore you must have done it, because to actually analyse the fact you didn't do it, you see what I mean? you have to go to the frontal cortex, which takes more energy, and you can't stay there too long. You go back emotionally to that subconscious bit that just knows that, oh, this is really important to you, you must have done it. That makes sense. So it actually helps us self-deceive, and of course it actually helps us bond with others if they see that if their instant reaction to us is you said something that makes them feel okay, this is a properly wired, properly put together moral person, they're doing the right things. So it's just kind of, I suppose, drawing out that while Jesus doesn't talk necessarily right at these roots, but what he's talking about is about addressing something that is a real struggle in real people, in kind of every one of us, and there are reasons for it, because it does make us popular. So in other words, both consciously and subconsciously, we make plays to display virtue or hide or balance. I have to read my words carefully. Both consciously and subconsciously, we may make displays of virtue to hide or balance our lack of it. So we're either kind of talking up what we have done, or we're disguising the fact we haven't, just in the way we present things, and we can be conscious of it. Which comes back to some of what we were doing the other weeks about the yes be yes and the honesty factors. But actually some of it is we actually, in doing so, we're kind of subconsciously doing it for other reasons. So Jesus puts righteousness in the context of something that we actually hunger and thirst for. So we're not just going to talk about, but actually we're going to hunger and thirst for it. And what's really interesting is that Jesus, without the benefits of 2,000 years of modern psychology and functional MRI scanners and all of those sorts of things, somehow knew, and he puts in all three of his areas of righteousness, the issue of you need to do it in secret where nobody knows. And because as a simple practice, so Jesus gives instructions saying, which actually, if we do live by them, genuinely actually help us see ourselves more clearly and actually bring about some transformation. So I've got last week's research. These were the findings of one of the papers we looked at last time. So people who genuinely value morality, which I put there in brackets, so they hunger and thirst for righteousness. So if you genuinely value it and you make it a part of your identity, then you're less likely to be hypocritical about it. That was one of the findings. And what that really means is to genuinely do it, actually they're doing a very similar thing to what we're going to look at with Jesus, which is if you strip away the benefits you get from the social context, how much does it still matter to you? See? How much you like to do it when nobody, it's not going to affect how much people like you or trust you or what they think of you. And that's what they're driving at. People who genuinely value, whether or not anybody knows, if they're giving in secret, how they're doing it in secret, if those and actually they do that because it is part of their identity, then those kinds of people are less likely to be hypocritical in their morality. I had a lovely little experience just in the last little while with somebody who wanted to become a partner, and so they're setting up the little partnership gift, and they just dropped a note saying, oh, I always like my, and I won't mention who they are now, so I always like my giving to be anonymous, so please don't thank me in the books. Which is nice because it wasn't a big thing, but you just want to say thank you for those that have helped. And actually what you realise with the person when they said it is he could be moral, he could, if you're cynical, you could say he's virtue signalling to me, but I don't see it that way at all. In the kind of privacy of the conversation, what you have is someone for whom this is their practice. They don't do any kind of giving and make a song and dance about it. And actually, as I thought about him and his access to places, I suspect he is a very good benefactor of lots of good projects. I don't know that because he hasn't told me about it, but I suspect he is, if I can put it that way. And so that was one of the conclusions, that if you genuinely value, so you do it even when nobody knows about it, and that's important to you, so it's part of your identity. Identity, we often have a big thing about, but part of identity is just what the habits are. What are our habits? Am I a writer? Well, if I write a few lines every day, then I am. Am I a musician? Well, if I'm playing more than every day, then I am. I don't have to be brilliant, but if I'm doing that all the time, so the habits we have. So if actually I'm doing righteous things just every day, just because, and I'm not getting any benefit from it, then I really being a virtuous person is part of my identity. If I play, whether or not I get paid for it, I really am a musician. Now there might be times when 90% of what I do get paid for, but if I don't do anything unless I get paid, it's not quite your identity in the same way. So always a challenge for me as someone. I do think teaching is part of my identity, but if I only ever did it because I got paid for it, I'm now laughing. So then that would be a sad state of affairs. But I'm very happy to teach if anybody will listen. This is the truth. So as I said, in that I put the middle too small because we weren't really interested. The hypocrites gain motivation from a desire to look good more than their internal desire to satisfy personal goals and conclusions. And then that last one down there, most people most affected by witnessing good acts will feel a stronger desire to act in a moral way. I did like that, and I highlighted a little bit because often when we hear Jesus, we've got to remember he's speaking to a context. So he's highlighting a direction. So he's not saying, because as Jesus is going to say, don't do it so people can see it. We shouldn't get hung up if people do see it, because Jesus, I don't think, is saying that there's a moral principle of nobody ever sees it. Because actually he talks about they see your good works and so glorify the Father, which actually is part of this last conclusion here, that actually others who are going to be drawn on this journey and who are themselves going to be stirred to being hungry and thirst for righteousness, actually when they see those things it does inspire them. I'll put it that way. A bit like the guy I just mentioned, who the general world will never know who they are, but actually in my relationship I found it very touching that they wanted to do it that way. You can think of it like that. So anyway, so those are just things we're putting together. So so social status has so social status is a key thing in this whole dialogue when Jesus is talking about hunger and thirsting for righteousness. And just a little thing, social status has a clear link with serotonin levels, and interestingly with testosterone. We won't touch into that. An activity that has important implications for mental health and well-being, because serotonin, as we know, is very important to those things. Again, it's one of the discoveries of modern psychology is there are two kind of key, if you like, there are two systems which are about self-esteem that circuits within the human head. So distinct roots to social status in humans, from which we draw self-esteem. We draw self-esteem from social status. And those two roots, and they can be shown in the head, are totally separate areas. They're different areas of the brain fire off, but they both end up having a similar sort of outcome. And one is dominance and the other is prestige. And that's really interesting. Sorry, just to kind of spill over to the current situation, for instance, in the last week with all the arguments about knife crime and so on, because for a while now there are psychologists who have been saying that we will be seeing increases of violence which are less directly to do with deprivation in terms of what people don't have, so much as actually a society in which there is less opportunities for people to achieve things and accomplish things, and therefore to achieve social status and esteem by prestige, i.e. the things they accomplish. And that is quite a subtle distinction, and because actually, so in days gone by, I've got a strong back and I can carry things from A to B, but today we just get a forklift truck and carry things from A to B. So actually that physical strength is less something I can have prestige from. So 10 years ago, but I could at least add up numbers quickly so I could bookkeep. Well, now any idiot can kind of turn on a piece of software and put the numbers in. You get what I'm driving. So various skills lose the ability to produce prestige. And so one of the things that I heard being predicted a while back is we shouldn't therefore be surprised then if we start seeing, particularly with young men, strength and violence becomes a route to prestige. And actually those circuits in the brain, which are actually very distinct, but they have a similar output. And so actually I now have status within my community because I lead the gang and I've gone through the violence and so on. So dominance and prestige seem to be two systems that are part of the way we build self-esteem. And growing up in a kind of Christian church, you never think about trying to put somebody down and crush them. But actually, if you like, prestige is in a good social group. There's one person, I'm thinking about my teenage years, I remember Vic, who was a genius at everything kind of athletic that anyone would ever do. So nobody could beat Vic at athletics, if you know what I mean. And I was always very good at maths, so I had my maths thing. It wasn't as valuable as being good at snooker like Vic was, but it has your thing. My friend Andy, had his artistic work that he used to do. So in actual fact, in a kind of a mix-up social community, prestige doesn't have to dominate, if they put it that way, but you can get the same effects from it. But dominance is that way of just by physically imposing, by aggression imposing yourself to the top of the tree. It uses different parts of the brain, but as I say, it produces a similar sense. So if we recognise that there is something in every human being that God has put there is a hunger for social value. We want to be, and we want to be recognised as such, as having value to contribute to the wider group. And so we can get there by developing prestige and usefulness. And we say actually it's really good to be useful, it's really good to have something to contribute. If we haven't got anything like that, then we will start to find people we can just dominate, if I can put it that way. And that's a slightly simplistic, but obviously in that mix, moral virtue is a cheap way to achieve prestige if you just fake it. So you may not want to be the biggest and fight the fight, which is probably not a bad thing. So instead, we just want to appear to be more right than everybody else. And so it's funny how in very non-Christian environments, you can go into where a kind of an office community is ruled with a rod of iron by someone who's always morally outraged. Their moral outrage may not be the things that I care about, but they will still be there. And they've kind of established within the group that everybody should care about these things, and they're the one who will guard them, and they will be the most virtuous in these areas. And if you fail in it, then you'll know about it, and I won't. Is that making sense? So just kind of spending a long time just kind of painting a picture as to why people do. So Jesus kind of draws our attention then to giving, prayer, fasting, which are the three big staples of Jewish religious life. So they are part of just the practice. They're all understood as being expressions of Deuteronomy 6 verse 5, which is, I think we've got it in here, you shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, which people say that's prayer. So if you're loving with all your heart, you're praying a lot. With all your soul, which has a kind of bodily side to it, so fasting. and with all your might, which is wealth giving. So that your kind of strength is your ability to create wealth and so on. So your might, Deuteronomy 6:5. So Jesus starts all three of the things, he addresses them, and he uses a common formula. So it says, when you do, in green, insert righteous act here. When you pray, when you fast, when you give alms, whatever. He then is don't, and then he gives an example that the hypocrites do, like the play actors do. I tell you, they have their reward. Then there's a bit where he talks about doing it secretly, and finishes, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. So all three are kind of written, they're put together with the same formula around them. And we often miss it because the prayer one has a big chunk in the middle where probably at some point the three sat there just without the Lord's Prayer in it, but that was a convenient point to include the Lord's Prayer because Jesus is talking about praying, and actually he taught us more about praying. He taught us how to pray too, so let's insert it in. But in doing so, we kind of sometimes we don't see the pattern quite so clearly because it just makes the prayer section that bit bigger. So it starts with, so when you're doing charity, don't sound a trumpet before yourself, like the play actors do. So green is the righteous act, is the colour, this is how you don't do it, like the play actors or hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. I went for the translation play actors because it is legitimate, it's totally legitimate for hypocrite. It's someone who plays a part. And we're so used to kind of the word hypocrite, but I wanted this sometimes, just as you read the passage, to kind of hear it in a slightly less censorious way, but in a more literal way. Because you can hear it with a slightly kinder tone to it, if I can put it that way. It's always difficult when we're reading the words of Jesus. He spoke in Aramaic in a context which uses hyperbole and uses whatever, translated into Greek, which is a language you won't speak, then translated into English. And so it's very easy to kind of hear, don't be the hypocrite. It's almost a bitter with the word hypocrite. I'm not saying we do, I'm saying it's possible. Whereas it's also possible, and that's why it's useful to hear it if don't be like the play actors. Don't which is actually kind of more, it's less judgmental to them. It's more about the encouragement to what I'm doing. Is I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be a play actor, but I know that I can be, so it's not. I can hear it slightly easier. Does that make sense? So I put it in there just for that reason. You can be either way. They do it in the synagogues and in the streets. They sound the trumpet. So much debate as to whether this is literal, whether it's metaphorical, because the offering boxes were like trumpets, so that people couldn't put their hand in to take the money out. And nobody knows for 100% for sure, but clearly it doesn't matter that we don't know the exact historical context, but we all get the picture, we all understand the image. Whether it is sounding a fanfare, it's a bit like I always used to think in the early days of Windows. You remember I used to turn on your computer, so it's the only machine in the house that kind of goes, well, hey, I'm here, ta-da! It's like, oh, you turn me on. It doesn't happen if you use the toaster. It's like, whoa, your toast is ready. But anyway, that's the way we're going. No. So don't make a big fanfare about it. You get your glory from men. So and then so be it, which is amen. So be it, amen. So be it. All right, if you want to. But I tell you what, you've received your reward. Oops, what's that? Nearly threw my tea everywhere. We're going to come, because what I was doing here was just showing you the formula, so I wasn't going to do the exposition. So next one, and when you pray, don't be like the play actors who love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so they can be clearly seen by people. See, again, it's the same language. Is they're doing something moral, but they're doing it very specifically to be seen. It's doing the moral thing, but for the wrong reason, the right thing for the wrong reason. Which is why I was saying it's so focused on is what is your hunger and thirst? Is it the actual benefit, or is it the process? Is it doing the right thing? So be it. They got their reward in full, and your Father who sees in secret will pay you. You see the same formula. And whenever you do fast, don't put on gloomy faces like the play actors. They make themselves unrecognisable. And that's a proper translation there. They make themselves unrecognisable. But I think we often hear it. I'm just trying, because I haven't got my paper Bible with me, but it's often kind of it's putting on a gloomy face or something. But yeah, it's quite. That's not me just kind of paraphrasing. It's quite legitimate to put it that way. It's disfiguring the face. So, so is to be seen fasting by people. So I tell you, they've got their reward in full. Same formula. Your Father who sees in secret will repay you. So you've got that's really nice thing, which is there's a kind of comprehensive approach, 3 areas which kind of make up the disciplines of the righteous life. We'll think about that right at the end as to why they're the kind of dimensions of righteousness. But in all of them, it's the same thing. There are people out there who do it. They do it in ways very specifically so that they are seen socially. Their morality is about social status. You should do it. And if you do it in a way where you're doing it secretly, then you'll really know that it's because of your desire for the Father, and actually that's how come you get the spiritual reward, if I can put it that way. So strip the practice, the kind of conclusion that is strip the practice of morality of its status benefits, and then we end up desiring it for its own sake. And it is I told you that thing about, okay, if you suddenly came to millions of pounds, what would be different next year in your life? That's one way of looking at it. The other is that thing of, I can remember, and it's something I have to challenge myself on all the time, is as someone who teaches the Bible. In fact, I got given a survey at the Prayer and Fasting Conference by someone who's doing a master's, and they want to survey how people read their Bibles. And I did say to him, so in one sense I said you'll get a twisted answer, because I read my Bible every day, but not necessarily for the right reasons. Just being really honest, is that actually if I'm speaking in the evening, or I'm going to, like I was on that day, then I am going to read my Bible. So I will have a tick on every day. That isn't the same as my personal Bible reading. That can be a bit more hit and miss.
Yeah. So I'm referencing something I have to do, but am I doing it?
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm saying is that thing. Yeah. But it helps to understand that, and I hear it, and I want to say it without judgment, because I think the focus of what Jesus is teaching is not to highlight our failure, but actually to highlight a practice that if we do it, gets us more honest about what we're doing, and actually strips it back so that we actually appreciate righteousness for its own sake. I can put it that way, rather than so doing it now in more detail. So alms giving. So there's a kind of taking a common way of thinking. Is the Wisdom of Sirach. That's the book we also call Ecclesiasticus. Got 2 quotes from it. Giving to the poor. So this is, you see, here's a way of seeing benefit. Giving to the poor can make up for sin, just as water can put out a blazing fire. Count among your treasure the fact that you give to the poor, because it will save you from all kinds of trouble. And that is expounded by the rabbis. Unfortunately, I haven't got any quotes from them, but apparently so. It's expounded by them but actually there was a teaching which again we understand emotionally, which is that in one sense alms giving, which is a righteous act, is kind of balancing out the things you got wrong elsewhere. And emotionally, I think most Christians have been there at some point or other. I can remember being in a meeting where there was a missions offering being taken, at a point where I was pretty sure I hadn't been. If I'm trying to be as honest as possible in this, when I kind of looking back, I think there'd been something where I hadn't been for some reason. I knew I hadn't been totally honest with Judith because it was just convenient. And we're in this missions offering, and I wrote a cheque for more than I could actually afford to give at the time. And I remember kind of thinking, this is really ridiculous. I did that because I felt bad about something which I should just be putting right, if you know what I mean. But actually, in that context, there is something in us emotionally that can feel. And you think about the whole, 1,000 years of Catholic history selling indulgences, it kind of, there's something in it that feels like, it ought to work. Emotionally, this ought to work. And so actually that is the context that Jesus is speaking into. Ecclesiasticus is about 2nd to 3rd century BC, so it's been around for a while. It's actually included in some, the Catholic Church originally included it in the canon of Scripture at one point. So you still will find it sometimes quoted. So it's had significance. Jesus actually quotes from it on one occasion in the Gospels, where he talks about wisdom being vindicated by all her children. Seems to be a reference to the same book. So it's part of the kind of common culture, this kind of logic, which as you'll see will make some sense. Because Jesus does actually say, I think, riches don't profit. sorry, this is a little bit. The way that Ecclesiasticus, or Wisdom of Sirach, was actually that concept was seen as being an exposition of Proverbs 11. So riches don't profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. So the logic kind of went, well, so if you've got riches, it's not going to help when it comes to the day of wrath. But if what you did with what you did have is you did good things with it, then that balances it all out, you see. So that was the biblical verse. But you can see the biblical verse is not quite where they've got to, but you can see how one kind of leads to the other. That was the logic. So, if you've got wealth, it's not going to help you much when it comes to the day of judgment. But tell you what, it's an half help if you say. And, in one sense, actually, we do hear a bit of that in Jesus when he says, in that you helped one of the least of these and you did it for me, when the Lord is saying, you did this, you did that, but do I know you? And Jesus says, but at least you did it here. So you can see actually that kind of thinking. There's sort of something there, but it's probably not quite as mechanical as the rabbis are making it, or the thinking in Jesus' day is making it. Because eventually Jesus is going to say, actually, there is a flow for forgiveness. If you don't forgive men, then your Father will not forgive your sin. So there is actually something of a flow of grace. But it's not quite as simple as I did A, so now I ought to pay B, which is where we can get to if you take it to extreme. So when you do charitable things, don't let your left hand know what your right hand does, so that your charity may be in secret, and then your Father who sees in secret will reward in turn. Again, just very kind of simply, that phrase which has it's interesting because it come into English, but it actually means two different things depending on context now. That sometimes we make a we make a virtue, don't let his right hand doesn't know what his left is doing, which is the way Jesus quotes it here. Other times we use it to say what a kind of omnishambles somebody's political party is. Their left hand doesn't know what their right's doing. So
particularly relevant at the moment.
Yeah, I know. So it's interesting. Obviously, it's where the phrase comes from, and we don't exactly know where it comes from when Jesus coins it, or if he makes it up. But obviously he's using it in the virtue sense. It's it's just about keeping it really secret. It's not about the omnishambles in there. So moving on, obviously from alms giving, we're not spending huge amounts of time on each, but part of the thing is about presenting the thing in the flow and stirring up thought, not being the last word necessarily. So when you pray, don't be as the hypocrites. They love to stand and pray in the synagogues, in the corners of the street, that they may be seen by men. So same again, they're doing it. Those play actors, I left the word in, hypocrite there, didn't I? Those play actors, most certainly I tell you, they've received their reward. But you, when you pray, enter the inner room, and having shut the door, pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And one of those little things that you will often hear drawn out is that the Father who is in the present tense. So the implication is it's not that you go and then the Lord turns up, but actually you go there to meet him. He's already waiting as part of the thing. And so Jesus creates that context and that space. And it's interesting when we think about Jesus' life that we hear that every morning he goes off to pray. But we only have a couple of occasions where we hear Jesus praying. The Garden of Gethsemane, of course, is a key one. Because actually it isn't really necessarily for our benefit. So we have a couple of examples which are very specific to us. We've got the Lord's Prayer, which is the way he taught us to pray rather than the prayer that he prayed. And we've got a couple of moments where Jesus says, not for their sake, but so that they may all where we hear Jesus praying. But we don't have huge amounts, but we know it was very common to him. So he does a huge amount every day, but that is part of his dialogue, and that's kind of the part of the healthy way. And so actually it's about desiring the presence, really. It's about desiring that communion and connection with the Lord. And in praying, don't use vain repetitions as the Gentiles do, because they think they'll be heard for their much speaking. But don't be like them, because your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Sorry, I'm laughing because there is another occasion, and this is one of the things people say, oh, is it contradiction? It's not. It's Jesus speaking into a context where he talks about banging in prayer, keep knocking, and so on. And in one sense, obviously what Jesus is doing is addressing two different elements. One is the kind of the need sometimes for perseverance in our prayer life, and the other is actually about, which I think is the context here, is about not going in with a sense that if you whine a lot that somehow God's going to do more for you. In fact, maybe I'm pushing it a bit harshly, but that's the way I kind of see it, is he knows how good you are and how bad you are. So no point telling him how good you are, no point telling him how bad you are. There's no point telling him how much it really means to you, and no point trying to negotiate with him and telling him something about it is much more about the communion and somehow bringing our needs before the Lord, if I can put it that way. And so he kind of brings out the rather obvious. He knows already. Okay, that doesn't mean don't tell him, but just remember when you do, it's not about the how, and it's not about the effort and so on you're putting in, and that whole thing of vain repetition. And I struggle with it genuinely. I just kind of comment on this things because we that balance of perseverance in prayer, and yet we don't want to become like I remember being in Tibet some years back with Joel, and you see the people going past the prayer wheels just knocking them, and their vain repetition, just keep on doing it 1,000 times, and then your prayer's gone up 1,000 times. And it's something about the quality of real relationship. I think it's that. Real relationship it knows the appropriateness in the right moment. So we don't want to ignore the fact that we don't want to. We want to stick with it in prayer. We want to participate with him in the breakthrough, but at the same time we don't want that to turn into the style that breaks the relationship, and actually we somehow feel that we earn it by doing enough, doing enough penance. So then Jesus goes on, so then pray this way, and obviously the Lord's Prayer has been done so many times by so many good teachers, so I'm not going to try and compete and do a kind of a quick Larry Lee, can you not tarry 1 hour, or even more recently people like Mark Stibbe did a really excellent process through the Lord's Prayer, some excellent things, but there are some patterns that's worth just drawing out. So our Father who's in heaven, may your name be kept holy, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us our bread for the coming day. That's a totally legitimate way of translating that. Give us today our daily bread, to the day and today bit. So let's start with our Father who's in heaven, may your name be kept holy. And so I put a couple of questions really with that. Is that I found, because it is remarkable, and I remember first going through the kind of Larry Lee book. I can still picture it, the blue one, if anyone remembers it. Does anyone else do that one? Yeah. It is remarkable when you discover how actually not only can you pray for an hour, but you can pray easily for 2 hours or 3 hours through this same prayer that you can recite in 10 seconds. I can sit down and go, Our Father who's in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. It's gone. But actually, equally, you can unpack each layer. And I found one of the things that could just take ages was that issue of what's in a name. And you go through different formulas, and so people say, so actually you meditate on fatherhood because it's our Father. But actually, another way of looking at it is the Lord says, our Father who's in heaven, may your name be kept holy. Well, what name do I use for him? Do I use Yahweh? Do I use Elohim? What does that say in my relationship with him? I know the name Yahweh Rapha, he's God my healer. That's actually part of my experience. I can talk about that. That's true. Maybe I feel a bit anxious about money, but he is also, Yahweh Yireh, God who will provide. Do I kind of take time on that? Is he El Shaddai? It doesn't all have to just be the Yahweh names. There are all these names for God in different aspects, and so yes, we can just go with Father, but equally there are loads of different nuancy bits. And actually just taking time in that. And what does it mean by keeping it holy? And keeping it holy, we often say, well, holy has got to do with separateness. And so in many ways it's just simply we're keeping it holy by breaking off that aspect of who God is, who the Father is, and just considering it in its own right, rather than just letting it all blend into my life and what needs to come next, if I can put it that way, his identity. So there's a whole way in which we can unpack what Jesus has given us in that first phrase. And I put the second question is, would the prayer be the same if it started, my Father who's in heaven? Because I think not, obviously. I think it's a kind of a fascinating thing, that actually, as I was talking at yesterday at prayer and fasting conference, I was taking that phrase, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. And I was talking about the process from self to God, and saying actually the middle is the hard bit. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand, to value themselves, to recognise their own value, and actually therefore they have something to contribute. But actually we all know that if we only love God in a conceptual way, and it's very easy to try and jump over the difficult thing, which is other people, if I can put it that way. It's easier to say I love God, which is why it says, isn't it, if you say you love God but you don't love your neighbour, who are you kidding? That actually, but actually that's only true because if part of our prayer is our Father, it is actually recognise that He is the Father of all humanity. If He's just my Father, it's much easier to say, no, I love Him, but those people are nothing like Him, so I don't like them. So there is something there is something powerful even just in the simple turn of phrase that actually as we aspire, and I know that He's giving me value, so I'm valuing myself, loving myself, but actually if I just focus now only on this relationship and it never spreads here, I never find it filling out with those around me, and it needs to be practical, it's not just a concept. But actually it's difficult to keep saying I love God because He's our Father, so these are my siblings, the kind of attention. So it's just nice, that nice start. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I put there, I always find that, as a single line, it's something that you can think of in so many different ways, but I find a very helpful thing is people often say, what should we pray? And particularly, here's the real situation. This is just it happens a lot, isn't it? So I've prayed for people who got healed, and I've also prayed for people who've not, they've died. So there's always this tension as to, it regularly becomes an argument in church circles. And Jesus talks about what we unified in prayer on. It's interesting how often we get into a breakdown of non-unity. Because there'll be someone who regularly will stand up and pray, we know the Lord's going to heal you, thank you Lord, and then 2 days later the person's dead, if you know what I mean. So there's an unhelpful thing, because faith is, I've said before, is not believing hard for something impossible or living in denial of truth. Faith comes by hearing, and so actually there is a place where we're saying, what is the Lord saying in this? First of all, we have to come from this position. But I always think you can always come from this position, from this question of, what would this situation look like if we were in heaven right now? Okay. So my prayer is, or my starting position therefore, is that there is never a time when it's not wrong to pray for healing, if I can put it that way. Because ultimately we know whether or not we're going to make it this time. We know that actually one day they'll be living without cancer, or one day they'll be living without whatever. They have more eternity ahead of them, cancer free, than they have days on earth with it or without it. You can put it that way. And so I find it a really helpful thing, which doesn't necessarily mean to say that I know that in 2 days' time the disease is going to go on, because I haven't heard something. And if I have heard, I'm trying to verify it in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. And it's as you kind of get those things coming together, where you kind of step through with more and more faith and confidence as you try and lead a community in a way where we stay unified in prayer, rather than it breaking down to, I can't believe that nutter's just stood up and said they're going to get healed, we don't know. Is that just because of my cynicism, because we failed last time, or is it because I'm genuine? Do you know how you have that kind of, all of that stuff starts bubbling up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I balance it with Ecclesiastes, because the Bible says there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to be healed. So I can find an easy balance.
Well, but the question is that time now or not? And what I'm saying is, even if it turns out,
I can approach it,
yeah,
on the basis that He said heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the leper.
Yeah,
I can approach it on that basis, but ultimately the final backstop is the Lord. So.
No, and so my approach going in is,
sorry.
It is the way He's actually taught us to pray is. What is what would it be if it was in heaven? If we were in heaven right now, well, you wouldn't have the cancer. So that's where we're going to start. That's not the same as saying in this earthly context it's going to be gone in 5 minutes. But we're going to start from there, and then we're going to look for how the Lord's leading us. And partly what I'm saying here is not a kind of theological absolute. It's more about the process of how we try and lead a community in prayer, for something that we don't 100% know. We've got different opinions and different views, but here's a nice backdrop. This is how heaven would want it. Because people say, oh well, perhaps they've got this as a punishment. Well, maybe not. That Jesus does say when that question comes up, doesn't he? Well, neither, but let's get on with and do something about it. But the
other guy says stop sinning or something worse may happen.
Yeah, and something worse may happen.
You expose yourself to something that's.
So that's why I'm saying I don't say it's not a legitimate question. I think Jesus' answer is that's not the question for right now. But so maybe not. But what we do know is that this won't be what it's like when heaven's finally here. So that's where I start. It also, and I put there, it also has an inward implication to it, and I wanted to draw it out from the Jewish side of things. So Psalm 103, Father's will, this is in heaven. So it says, "Praise Yahweh, you angels of His who are mighty in strength, who fulfill His word, obeying the voice of His word." Praise Yahweh and the voice of His word. That's the reason I highlighted that in green I capitalised the word "word." Remember that in the Old Testament the word, the Dabarah, is actually a kind of manifestation of God, and you can see that because the manifestation, which is the word, has a voice. So the word's got a voice in this one here. So the Father's will in heaven is happening because the angels who are mighty in strength are fulfilling the things that are coming to them by the voice of His word, by the sound of that manifestation of God. Praise Yahweh, all you armies of His, you servants of His who do His pleasure. So it's actually the army of angels, His servants, who are in heaven doing, in their praising of the Lord, they actually end up becoming the doers of the very thing that the Lord's will is, if I can put it that way. Which is why I say there is a kind of an inward implication. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So actually one of the things we have to start with is, what's my response to that? Actually, am I going to stand like the angels who obey His voice, and the first thing I do is I kind of do something towards it? Or do I want to just ask Him to do something while I'm just separated away from it? So again, it's not a full story. I'm just kind of highlighting from a Jewish way of thinking, that idea of well, not just Jewish, but in the Psalms, that the Lord in heaven is getting His will done, but He is getting His will done by servants who are listening to what He's saying and doing it. So it almost sets you up for a response, and that kind of goes with that little bit that I was just touching on. That we have a foundation layer. What would it be like in heaven? Now I'm also trying to listen, because faith comes by hearing. If I've got faith, I can try and respond in my prayer by faith. Give us our bread for the coming day. Again, there is now there is this kind of implication to listen in the prayer, because as Jesus quotes twice from Deuteronomy, man doesn't live by bread alone, but every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. That's a common understanding in Jesus' day, that the idea of daily bread, as we've turned it into, actually is very Jewish. It is that the communication of the Lord, and of course we can do that in a physical way by reading Scripture. And if you go to a much more firmly, solidly evangelical way, but equally I think it is that part of the freshness of trying to listen in part of our prayer response. So we're praying, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Just of course in heaven it's your servants who hear your word, who do it, and actually therefore you're giving us our daily bread, and there's a certain amount that's needs, but there is also a certain sense in which it's not just needs, because what we live on is what you're saying to us day by day, and that can become part of the process of something that's more interactive. And you can imagine, the reason I suppose I'm spinning it out like this is, I suspect in this room, because everyone here has walked with the Lord for a while, but we're kind of trying to teach people that it's not the formula of the word, but there's something about the toing and froing. And I think that you can see some of the toing and froing when you kind of think about, when you expand each line. So unlike when you're at primary school, we went to a Church of England primary school where we just all said it in unison, and it's saying it out there. Actually, the words actually invite listening. They invite that kind of response, and so on. So he goes on, and forgive us our debts as we forgive those, as we've forgiven our debtors, and don't lead us into testing, rather deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Which is in square brackets, because in some of the earliest manuscripts it's not there, and that's not a big shock, if I can put it that way. What it kind of tells us, or it hints at, is something of the way in which the prayer, which is in the flow of a bigger document, has obviously become part of the life of the church in its own right. And when we finish it all, just like, here endeth the lesson, like you do in the Anglican prayer book, we've learnt that prayer and we conclude it with forever and ever, amen. And so actually, as it's then kind of worked its way back into the text of Matthew. Nothing kind of contradictory or anything like that in that. It tells us the life that's going on in the church. So if we go through it line by line, forgive us our debts as we've forgiven our debtors, which illustrates that prayer is more than words, because it is actually reflected in our actions. So as we've been going through, we give our words out, we're trying to listen, and actually we're trying to respond. So actually, there is a kind of a process. We're asking for something, but actually we're asking for it in a confidence that we have already expressed something of heaven's will by our own forgiveness of those around us. So there is a kind of almost a putting ourselves in the place of we're fulfilling what we're hearing from heaven, and then we kind of respond it back. So again, I know what I'm hoping to get through is it's about process. The prayer is about process, not just delivery. And it involves speaking out, it involves listening back, it involves taking decisions inside to release others in debt, which actually in turn kind of take us back in the cycle, because we're in that process, we're in that flow, we're exhibiting it by faith. I'm letting go of my rights here, and thank you, therefore you let go of your rights over me, and actually you forgive me, and so on. And don't lead us into testing, but deliver us from evil. And it's interesting, just think about how Jesus prays in Gethsemane, because he actually prays along those lines. Father, if there's any way for this cup to pass from me, but not my will, but yours. He is praying, don't let me have to go through this test. Don't let me have to go through. Of course, as it turns out, that in part of that dialogue process, he is also recognising that he needs to, which again kind of gives us some kind of understanding here.
Got to get the simulator.
Yeah, and so we it's absolutely fine. I'm going to go through something terrible. I can say, Lord, I really don't want to go through it, but even when I'm going through it, I'll know you're with me. So that's and rather deliver us from evil. And of course, actually, the Lord does deliver from evil, but he still goes through the test. We'll put those things. So I'm just saying it's interesting just to see Jesus didn't just kind of teach the words; he lives through those. He prays them. And then we get this final little bit, conclusion, because if you forgive men their faults, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. If you don't forgive men their faults, neither will your Father forgive your faults. And it's kind of, there's this little extra coda which seems to be so key, because we get it quite regularly. And it's not about, we don't want to fall into the trap of making it kind of a gospel of works, i.e. because I forgive, therefore God forgives me. But it is about something about process, is that we are supposed to be in a dynamic flow. And part of the reason it's worth drawing this out is because there are very often, if you like, the philosophically higher-minded theological positions get to a point where almost nothing matters, if I can put it that way. So I'm righteous because I'm covered by the blood of the Lamb, and I prayed the prayer like Paul said. So therefore I'm righteous. So the fact, and you can see it in the history of kind of the established churches, whether it's Catholic or Lutheran or Church of England, where people get to that position where they kind of can sin that grace may abound. It's that kind of almost logic in the way things work. And so it's not that is saying that actually you're not forgiven because you're finding it a struggle with forgiveness, but it is kind of saying that actually it's part of the process. And therefore prayer is not just words out this way, it's words come back, it's also actions that are part of it. And so actually we want to, if we want to be effective and fruitful in our prayers, we need to live by the kind of standards we're praying. And actually it's not that by doing so we earn something, but actually we show an integrity in what we're praying for. So we really are hungry and thirsting for righteousness, not just the successful outcomes. So moving on to the last little bit, which is on fasting. So when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face. It's just interesting with all of these things. I only thought a bit there now, but it's none of them are if, they're all when. and so actually, I always grew up with that as kind of the logic, which is why during the week I was at my parents' church's prayer and fasting conference, because actually they put weeks of prayer and fasting just into the calendar for the year, and people join them in their different ways. People are encouraged to do them at whatever level is appropriate, because there is a kind of a when rather than an if, just as with the others. So you're not seen by men to be fasting. So again, there's the whole thing. There's not making it something that you're going around telling everybody about. That I can remember as a teenager when we all got very enthusiastic for the Lord, because we had some really fantastic kind of self-led prayer times, and the Spirit would turn up. So we got into competitive fasting. So I can actually remember it kind of going around. So it's kind of very serious. As I'm doing a 3-day, or I'm doing a weeker, I do know that was the first contact. Was a young guy, and he did a 40-day. That was quite impressive, and that's when I decided I'm not going to compete on this anymore.
Well, yeah, that was the end of you after 40 days.
He was skinny to start with, so anyway, yeah. Well done him.
I think 40 days is about how long you can last without serious damage or death.
Yeah. So, but having said that, I know I went to, I had the privilege when I'd spent 8 months in the US. Was Lou Engle, who's one of the kind of key kind of prayer movements in the call and so on in the US. He every year did a 40-day fast. I remember him speaking once. He said I've broken more 40-day fasts than most people have done. He said, he said the reality is, he said, just it's become part of my spiritual life. He said actually I break more fasts than I start, or than I complete. I said. But it's just become part of my. I intend that I'm going to fast for a week, but actually after 2 days something happens and I don't. So you don't get hung up about these things. It's just part of the flow. That sounds like he was telling everybody, but I'm telling you rather than him. It's in that context. I haven't really thought. I should have thought this through before, kind of sitting down or put it onto a slide, really. But this is kind of my concluding sort of area now. Slide now. I just kind of noticing this, that the prayer there is a kind of sense, if you look at these dimensions of Jesus uses 3 things, but actually as we touched into it, there are other elements like forgiveness that are part of righteousness. But he's chosen these kind of 3 examples, which kind of make up the idea of the kind of Jewish righteous life, and which was seen as being part of the Deuteronomy verse, and loving the Lord God with all your heart. That's your prayer life, and all of your soul. That's your fasting life, and all of your strength. That's with your giving. These kind of different dimensions. But there's a kind of an interesting, if you think about it, is that prayer is about something that goes up. It goes up and it goes down, as we've been thinking. It's about the vertical in one sense. Alms is kind of really about the horizontal, because it goes out, and fasting is about what goes in. And I just thought, as I was thinking about it, actually that is kind of all the dimensions of the way in which kind of righteousness works, if you like. There's about that inner process. There's about the kind of binding corporate love towards others process, the going out, and there's also the vertical kind of two-way. So Jesus is kind of by giving a simple set of illustrations. So he hasn't made it too difficult. He's not gone through 1,001 different things you can do today to be righteous, but he has kind of covered the different directions, and in all of them he's painted the same picture, which is why I say it so clearly sits with hunger and thirsting for righteousness, which is do it, but try and do it in a way that, because it's secret, you end up doing it for the right reasons. You discover what that discipline is really about, if you like. You discover that actually fasting is about taking seriously what's going into us. I mean, it's interesting that within fasting, if you think about it covenantally, throw that word around, that every covenant has always had prohibitions about eating. I mean, it's not just going through periods when you don't eat at all. It's about things you do eat and don't eat, and so on. So and you say, well, why Jesus declares all things clean, so that doesn't matter. But actually, what it's teaching you as you do it is what goes into me. And so fasting is making me think about what's feeding me, whether that is what books I'm reading, what company I'm in during the day, and what's going into me, making me think about those things. It's giving that inward perspective. My almsgiving is making me think about those around me, their needs, my response to their needs, and there's that kind of, it stretches me in that way here. And prayer actually puts me directly to make myself accountable and responsible to the Lord, and to listen back. And so in that sense, as I say, he's really nicely packaged all three of the things, those three kind of dimensions. He's stripped it back to what would it be like if you're doing it in secret, if nobody else is seeing it? What would it feel like? What would the quality be? Why would you be doing it? And puts those kind of questions on us. And just kind of come back to that final bit where we started, really. I think it was my last slide. Which is, remember I said that we like people who seem to have a genuine morality to them, and if morality seems too easy, we kind of start to know that either there's something wrong with the way their brain works, or they're not being truthful. I'll put it that way. And in that context, we very quickly spot the people that we think of as self-righteousness, which really means we don't really trust what they're signalling to us, if that makes sense. And actually Jesus is looking for folks whose righteousness is attractive. And we thought about this in the first week, that sometimes persecution comes because it's a challenge. Well, you can't help that, but at least we can try and do righteousness in a way that doesn't become unattractive because it feels fake. And so we saw those things. Well, if we're genuinely trying to grow in this righteousness, and we see that as part of our identity, is that's who I want to be, that's how I'm going to build these habits, I'm going to express this identity by doing these things, then we're less likely to be hypocritical about it, and we're less likely to project that sense of self-righteousness or fake righteousness. And people will then it's more likely they will see our good works and glorify our Father rather than glorifying us. Perhaps where we finish. So I feel like we've come to a crashing end because we've come to a final slide. But does anyone, I say anyone, do either of you do you want to ask anything or say anything as we do this little bit?
So again, about the will of the Father things, that tension between, say, the healing thing.
Yeah.
As we pray for people, they've died. We pray for people who've been healed.
Yeah.
Same thing.
I would say the only thing you do know is if I don't pray for them, they probably won't get healed. So let's at least pray and see what happens.
Well, I think, Jesus told us to heal the sick.
Yeah.
So probably I'll pray for them, but personally we'll command the sickness to you. But the balance then is that the will of the Father, and say what are we hearing?
Yeah.
I don't often hear God saying this person's going to die.
Yeah.
We're all going to die anyway.
Yeah.
But what I hear is the scripture in Ecclesiastes. Well, there is a time.
Yeah.
And
there is
and it also says within that tension within that your kingdom come, your will be.
Yeah.
And the other part of that, your kingdom come with them. I always see that as a spiritual warfare issue.
Yeah.
As well. It's a multi-role aspect, but in a very childish sense, I sort of see a sort of childish picture of a castle, or Satan's last or his kingdom, and that every time we pray that, Lord, let your kingdom come on earth, as it is in heaven. There's a cannibal knocks a chink out of his wall, or something, in a very childish sense. But there's a component of it that when we pray is moving into that realm, as well as our interpersonal realm with the Lord.
No, I think absolutely, and I wouldn't want nothing we're saying tonight is prescribing anything else. It's just what we're really getting across is the prayer becomes part of a process which involves words up, words listening, actions out, because I'm forgiving as I get forgiven. It's produced, so it becomes a holistic sort of thing.
Something said about like, what you see in heaven. Obviously, we're asking for open heaven, that sort of thing. But as you say, it is a process because we're part of the machine, if you like. I don't like machine is impersonal, but part of the kingdom, part of the business of heaven. So we go about doing what the angel said in Psalm 103. attempting
to
do.
do. Yeah, they're doing the words that they're given.
With all our hypocrisies and failings and what have you, but we are trying to trying to move in the direction where we're doing the will of our Father.
Yeah.
However haltingly or
and that which is exactly why I want to get this across is more of a it's not that if you don't do it the right way, don't do it at all. It's just that actually if you can try and strip it back down, then actually you will discover more of the purity of what you're doing it for.
That's right. It's better to stumble along the road if you can't walk properly than sit down and give up.
Yeah. The reality is we all like to feel smug when we get prayers answered. But actually it's still better that someone got healed when we prayed for them than the bad thing of that we maybe felt a little bit proud about it.
But there's also a sense I find, over the years and seeing these things, it's sort of, somebody gets healed, right? Hallelujah, everyone's leaping around, hallelujah. And I'm thinking, am I a Spock here? This I'm thinking at the beginning of this. It scared me. I think, am I too logical? My feelings are, yes, that's how it should be.
Mm-hmm.
That's how, that is the kingdom. And I should be, yes, how it should be. There's a guy in our group, a Scottish fellow. He had lymphoma.
Mm-hmm.
His mother and sister both died of the same thing at the same age.
Yeah.
His curse out working. But he's a word man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very just tick the word as the word.
Yeah.
And he didn't go to the doctor. The lesions broke out on his body and the lymph and he just said, I didn't ask loads of people to pray for me, I just got one or two maybe, and I took painkillers. And he said at first the devil started playing by my mind, saying, well, you're going to have to arrange your funeral, and I said, and he said, I'm not going down that road, no.
Yeah.
And he said, I got rid of it in the shower. Said,
right.
The demonic power behind it. But he said after about 5 weeks the lesions started to scab over, and they healed up.
Right.
I said, if I had chemo, I wouldn't be here now.
Yeah.
The same thing would happen to my mum and my sister. But he's just
no, I
wouldn't let it happen.
because I know, and it's that would be a very Smith Wigglesworth kind of position. If you know what I mean, and then you get kind of on the Bethel position, which is healing is healing. I don't, but actually we're looking for the Lord to, that it's the outcome, not the process that we're praying for. So they would go for it. So I don't know always, we know.
He's an illustration that he wasn't going to accept it.
Yeah.
He basically went and parked his tanks on the devil's lawn there and said, right, no.
So I'm not taking it.
At the beginning, the shock of it, I started making up my mind on I better get my affairs in order. Because you know what happened to his mother. Then the Holy Spirit wakes him up. Says, no, hang on. So they wouldn't. He has a couple of testimonies, I think.
But it is a great story.
And this happened. He was part of jail. So.
Yeah.
But he's a sort of nature. He will just okay. And I got rid of it in the shower one day, so that was it.
Yeah, and he can put his moment when he knows we got that.
And the Lord said, "But you need your faith now, don't you?"
Yeah.
So, but then I thought, well, yeah, what choice do you really have? He figured, well, he'd seen his mother and his sister.
Mm-hmm.
I guess they'd had the chemo stuff. It still killed them.
Yeah.
So I'm near gonna have that. So,
yeah.
And so he just stuck, doggedly stuck.
Yeah.
And wouldn't give up. There's and if he was wrong, he was dead.
Yeah.
But if he'd gone to the chemo, he'd have been uncomfortable and dead.
Yeah.
But it was just that interesting. He just stood on the word. A word says this, and so in other words, he parked his tanks on the devil's lawn and said, right, we're going to fight this one out.
Yeah.
It's near my time.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
but it's interesting, but the Lord he was having the dialogue with the Lord in all this.
Yes, I know it's true. It's what you're still saying the same. There is that kind of.
Yeah.
And he knows when the breakthrough came, and he knows the.
Yeah, the Lord said, well, now as you've been talking about faith, now you need to use it. And I've been healed in a similar way. I'd have created a miracle in my body in a similar way.
Yeah.
That wasn't anything serious like cancer, praise God, but it might as well have been. But same sort of thing. But what's the will of the Father? Heal the sick, resurrect. Okay, fine. But then there is a time when we have to go.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
So I find the tension, that balance quite easy.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think, because then I think, am I being hypocritical here when we're leading a group, when we're praying for sickness, but then someone dies.
Yeah.
How do we balance that? But then I always balance it the same way.
Yeah.
It's okay, Lord. Well, at the end of the day, you've got them.
No, and you know, it's a bit. Obviously, I'm showing enough. You know, with my own story, I remember coming through, having been given 3 months to live, which is you come out recognizing that actually death isn't so much the problem. Jesus has dealt with death. It's separation, and that's a real issue that we have to face. But actually, we all have to face it at some point. And the opportunity and whatever, and so it's totally legitimate to process with the Lord if we've lost a child, say, the opportunities they didn't have, and all of those sorts of things. But the fact that if particularly, you know, if they've died in Christ, that actually death isn't the issue really. It's actually just it's a different sort of loss when you put it in those ways, and there is, because actually, you know, apart from when the Lord comes again, all of us will. Will face death at some point. So
like us to be some real mercies in it. Angus Buchan, the South African farmer preacher guy.
Right.
He is at a farm in KwaZulu Natal, and there was a terrible storm like there are this time of year, and they came to him and said that it struck one of the workers' houses, and so and so's been killed. Come quick! So he comes down there, and sure enough, this lady's dead. The lightning strike, it struck the house. Oh, she's dead. Anyway, I forget how he does it. He raises her from dead, basically.
Yeah.
And then not that long after, he's on the tractor with his son and his nephew, and they wanted to go. He was going to take the tractor, and his brother was there, and the nephew said, "Oh, Dad, can I go on the tractor?" He said, "Yeah, sure." Off he goes, son. So it's on the tractor. They hit a divot or something, or a rut. The kid fell off and got killed under the tractor. He said, "Now, how do you balance that between raising one of his workers from the dead, and him killing his own nephew, right, by accident?" But about 2 weeks later, the boy came the dream, his brother's dream, and said, "Hi, don't worry about me. I'm the Lord now. I'll see you guys when you get here. I'm fine."
Yeah.
So he said, thank God for that mercy. Yeah. But how do you balance this terrible thing?
Yeah. No, and I think, you know, at the heart of it, those are the tensions of pastoral work, which is there's no catch-all wisdoms, but there is it's a very beautiful thing. You know, I think of myself predominantly as kind of as a pastor teacher. And which is funny because I always used to think, I don't want to do those. I want to be an evangelist. I want to do this. but I actually recognise you know, it's not pain-free to be with someone in painful situations, but it is very satisfying when you see the Lord working and ministering and actually bringing resolutions and peace into situations that otherwise wouldn't have them. So
I always find that little balance that goes with the scripture. So you don't get out of balance one way or the other, because people get, why did so and so die? We prayed. Okay, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
We did everything that we knew how to do. Finally, it's up to the Lord.
Yeah.
We've taken the stand that we thought we should have taken.
Yeah, and we do what we can do, and that's what I'm saying. Is so we.
Maybe I'm too Spock-like like that. That's
well, but I was going to say, except that what you're describing, you see, is we do approach it as a process, and as I say, it's not that the final answer is right or wrong. It's actually if someone is just whatever. Actually it's just that we're wired to recognise that, if you like, there should be value. I think that while every life is equally valued, the people the Lord connects us to, we have to give a kind of, if you like, certain focus to. The funny thing is, we can sometimes use, if you like, the opposite as an excuse not to give them much. Because actually, so it's a bit like whatever I might have helped my parents with, well, actually it's set aside to the Lord. I'm still going to give it, but I'm not going to give it to these people, if you see what I mean. That actually, I think there is something of these dynamics that the Lord puts us with that we have to recognise as part of His gift to us.
You say the process is the word you use.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, I understand what you're saying. I'm trying to find a word that is a bit more than process, in the mix somehow. It's all in the mix, isn't it? That we participate in that life of the Lord.
Yeah,
and all these aspects and facets of it, we can get unbalanced if we forget what His word says. And also when we're here, another time we went to a meeting in India. I'd be able to preach on the day before, and the Good Friday meeting, the Lord gave me a message only 10 minutes before the meeting.
Yeah.
The next day, remembering that tension, Lord, why did you know, if somebody gives you a download at the last moment and then you go with it, or maybe this is an evangelist thing, but, and then I pitched up the village and I said, Lord, what do I say to these village people? I can't do all, they don't even read or write, are they? They're just trusting in Jesus for salvation initially, and he just said, heal the sick.
Yeah.
So, now this is the selfish, fleshly part of me. He says, oh, brilliant, I'm off the hook. I don't have to put a message together. So I did this, I think we spoke for 5-10 minutes max. I said, right, bring all the sick, we'll pray for them then.
Yeah.
And 2 days later, the pastor rings up and said, everyone got healed.
Fantastic, yeah.
But that doesn't happen every meeting.
No, yeah.
But I just said, like, what do I do here? Because these are just simple villages.
Yeah.
How do I connect with it? And I know you will, Lord, but I've got to be playing my little bit.
Yeah.
So that's hearing, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Your kingdom come.
Come your in here and yeah.
What do you want? What should I do? It's often that desperation. It's like, I don't know what to do. There was one of the guys there who raised a guy from a guy I used to know in the same area. They've planted thousands of churches in India. But when he started, he was preaching in the same tiny little village I was, and he prayed for people who'd literally come off their deathbed. But then, in the next little village along, a child had died in a pond, in one of the little reservoirs. And the mother, they said, there's a pastor in the next village, take the child there. And the mother brings, it's a hamlet really, the next hamlet along.
Yeah.
And so she comes on, brings a dead child, and she walks straight up to him, and he's in full Indian Pentecostal flow. And she just puts the dead child in his arms. He said, I was shocked. I hadn't been trained to do this. No one's told me what to do. And I said, I didn't know what to do. I just had this dead boy in my arms. So he just commanded everyone in the meeting to stand up and start worshipping because he didn't know what else to do. Meanwhile, I was going, what? I've not been trained. And he said they started doing the Indian Pentecostal, hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Anyway, after 15 minutes, this boy jerked into life. But he wasn't prepared. But he was in the process,
in the flow,
in the mix.
Yeah.
That's probably the most sort of exciting or rewarding, frustrating, scary.
But also that's what I was driving at. Is the human side. And that's what we're looking for. Is that?
So yes, that sort of. I think going back to what you were saying about the. I keep thinking about Captain Kirk.
Yeah.
We warned Kirk because Kirk has to deal with McCoy and Spock.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kirk messes up.
Yeah.
And has to get straightened out by Spock or McCoy.
Yeah.
Or whatever. But he's
trying to balance them. That's the human. That's the human side.
Spock would leave us on the planet.
Yeah.
With the Klingons, almost on our necks. But Kirk will try and look for a way of getting us out of there, rather than just throwing us under the bus like Spock would. So we warmed to that. It's really interesting you say that. I must do better at that little thing. But then young people today won't understand Spock or Kirk or the.
No. But I thought it was kind of interesting to hear that actually I guess it was if we can't see someone going through that process. If you like, which is not necessarily actually we understand when if they go through the process properly, which means that they seem to be valuing the qualities of the relationships around them. We don't mind them coming to the Spock conclusion, but if we can't see that at all, we tend to think actually I'm just another statistic to the person. It's not conscious; it's subconscious.
They'll throw me under the bus at the first convenience,
or not necessarily convenience, but if need be, I'm
expendable.
I'm expendable. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny to think about all the heroes in films. Again, some of the classic ones, I think a lot of the Indian ones, But there's a flaw.
Yeah.
But it's not a fatal flaw. It's a human flaw.
Yeah.
And they're tempted this way or that way, but they still have to whatever they're doing. But either way, that makes them appealing as a hero.
Yeah.
Because they're human.
Because they're human. Yeah. Which is why I think Marvel superheroes tend to do better than DC ones, because the DC ones tend to be all one thing, don't they?
DC one.
So Superman.
Oh, okay.
So people prefer Wolverine with all his flaws, but it's kind of like, well, I understand the emotional side of what this person's going through. So as I say, that's off. Whereas DC's big thing is driven by Superman, who is so kind of perfect at everything that
Yeah.
people don't relate. But anyway, well, let's we can stop the stream, I guess. So I'll probably trim some of the conversation out just so that.
Oh well, yeah.